Dr. Joseph Goldstein. We have also Dr. Lily Filler, our wonderful president and a pioneer in her own right as a woman physician in South Carolina. And we have Alan Banoff, an attorney, the grandson of Dr. Leon Banoff, a fascinating character we'll be talking about today. And Alan has just done a wonderful job of commemorating the legacy of his outstanding grandfather, and we welcomed him. I think from the outset, we ought to just talk a little bit about the condition of medicine at the founding of the colonies and into the early republic. Medicine in America was really behind Europe. But in South Carolina, founded in 1670, we don't have a medical college in the state until 1824. So that entire era, how did doctors get trained? Well, they apprenticed. They went to the offices primarily. They went to the offices of other physicians and trained like lawyers used to read law. It was called reading medicine. And they went there, and a number of, I'd say most South Carolina physicians, that is how they were trained. The most elite were trained, they went to Europe. They would go to Scotland or to the European continent. Many of the countries wouldn't allow Jews to be in medical schools, but the ones that did, definitely there were some training. You'll see when we get into our vignettes, a number of these South Carolina Jewish physicians are trained abroad. I think it's interesting that notably among the 13 original colonies, there were no barriers or restrictions to Jewish medical practice. That is, Jews were not prohibited from being licensed as physicians, something that was certainly not true in many European countries. Jews were barred from many professions. And really at the time of the Revolution, there are parts of Europe where Jews are locked in ghettos at night. South Carolina's experience and the United States experience is very different. And these Jews, the path of the Jews to South Carolina is kind of interesting. The Inquisition, which, we all know 1492 when Columbus sails, well, the Inquisition had occurred in the years preceding that and continued afterwards. It was a traumatic experience for the highly sophisticated cultured Jews of the Iberian Peninsula, Portugal and Spain. And Jews were very active in the medical profession in both of those countries. Many were Marranos, secret Jews. They remained Jews, but they outwardly were members of the Catholic faith. A number of the families went to Holland or into England, and many of those eventually migrated to the West Indies, running away basically from the established church of those countries, so they could practice their faith. And many of those then were the earliest settlers to South Carolina. So, and we'll see here among the earliest Jewish physicians, obviously Sephardic names, Spanish, Portuguese names. But Jews were at the beginning of this country. Jewish physicians were engaged. Two physicians on board for Columbus's trip to the New World were Marranos, were secret Jews. Dr. Samuel Ribeiro was the only physician in the colony of Georgia. And when it was founded and there was a terrible yellow fever epidemic, Dr. Ribeiro was a key figure in protecting the health of these early colonists. The trustees of Georgia heard there were Jews in the Georgia colony, and they told Oglethorpe, who was the head of the colony, to get rid of them. And he told them about Dr. Ribeiro. He said, I'm not getting rid of them. And he welcomed Jews to Georgia. Thus the community, the prominent Jewish community of Savannah that dates back to its earliest days. South Carolina, as you've heard, for those who've listened to this program, know that South Carolina had the largest Jewish community of any city, of any state. South Carolina did, and Charleston had the largest Jewish community of any city in North America until 1830. Why was that? Because Jews were welcomed in South Carolina and in the Carolina colony. The first first constitution in human history to provide for religious freedom was the famous fundamental constitutions of the Carolina, which was written by John Locke. So there's quite a story here and quite a tradition. And so those early Jews who arrive here and who practice medicine, many of them are come from this long legacy of learning and training of the Sephardim who come to the New World. So with that, let me with that background, I'm going to begin the first of the vignettes. We're going to do, I guess, 6 vignettes here, and I'm going to talk about the first Jewish physician in South Carolina. Rachel, can we pop up the PowerPoint for Dr. Levi Myers? Yeah, and yep. Yeah, Dr. If we could go back, yeah, Dr. When we were working on trying to determine the first Jewish lawyers in South Carolina, we came across 2 brothers who were basically the first Jewish attorneys in South Carolina. These 2 Levi brothers, and it was Moses, who was the first lawyer, and Abraham the second. Their father was a planner. The Jewish community in Georgetown was just completely fascinating. There have been 6 Jewish mayors of Georgetown, and these early early Jewish settlers in Georgetown were really the leaders of the community. So, you know, I remembered in passing when we were talking about these early Jewish lawyers, Moses and Abraham, I remembered there was the brother was a doctor. And, you know, was that unusual? If you've got a Jewish lawyer, he's got all of them have a brother who's a doctor, right? And so I started digging on Levi Myers, dug out his name, and I had really some remarkable discoveries about him. First of all, he's the oldest brother. He is licensed as a physician before the brothers become lawyers. He goes in the 1780s. He originally is trained in an office in Charleston, like many of these apprenticing physicians. And he wanted more. So he goes to Scotland, trains at the University of Edinburgh, and then at Glasgow, and is the first Jewish graduate of the University of Glasgow Medical School. And what we know, you may remember when we had Dr. Halpern talking about the Jews who went to Scotland to avoid the quotas. Well, Scotland had this great tradition, A, of excellent medical training, and B, of being open to Jews. And the first of those was Levi Myers. So he comes back comes home to Georgetown, and he opens a medical practice, and he runs for the legislature, 1796. And he is elected. And to our surprise, Robert and I were like amazed. We missed this. He's the first Jew in the New Republic elected to a state legislature in any state. Same guy, first lawyer, first state legislator, Jewish state legislator. He then in 1800 becomes something called the Apothecary General of South Carolina, which apparently is responsible for gathering necessary medicines for the state. And he holds that position until 1822. He's the first Jew selected to the South Carolina Medical Society. It's not a group, you don't just automatically become a member, it's an honorary group. He's the first Jew selected. He leaves Georgetown, goes to Charleston to improve to expand the educational opportunities for his children. Doesn't that sound typical? And then he returns to Georgetown and he continues to practice there. He is, you know, really immensely respected. And in 1822, a terrible hurricane hits the coast of South Carolina, and Dr. Myers and his entire family are drowned, washed to sea, never found again. It's a horrible, horrible story. And we located a tribute to Dr. Myers in a Charleston newspaper. And I just thought it just sort of summed up beautifully the level of respect and acceptance he had in his native state. He confined himself to the accumulation of practical experience. and improved upon by unceasing observation and study. By the application of such observation at the bedside and strengthened by an acute discrimination, he never lost the most trifling lesson a successful practice afforded. Mild in argument, he was no less correct in his decisions, and the hearer could always discern the strength and nobleness of the human mind. So that was Dr. Levi Myers, the first of our South Carolina Jewish physicians. And Robert, let me hand off to you to talk about Dr. Benjamin Rodriguez.
Yeah, and I also wanted to add, that he also studied under David Ramsey, and that's the name. If people read South Carolina history, Ramsey is a very important figure and one of the earliest historians of South Carolina. So he's really tied in with the establishment people. It's really funny, these names, how Rodriguez, you don't think of as a Jewish name. We had in the Jewish world, the Spanish names are the aristocrats. So the Rodriguez family are Sephardic Jews that come, from Spain and Portugal, and they arrive in Charleston in the early 18th century. He's educated in public schools in Charleston, graduated from Charleston High School, attended the College of Charleston, and as Richard said, he studied with other doctors. So he studied with a Dr. Frost and a Dr. Brewster. And so his certificate to be able to be a doctor and mainly a dentist, he was actually trained as a doctor, but he worked primarily as a dental surgeon. And
among the first oral surgeons in the United States, right?
Right.
He's a pioneering oral surgeon.
So he gets a certificate from Dr. Brewster, saying that he's competent to practice dentistry and oral medicine. There was no real legal definition of a doctor. So he's very young when he does all this. He goes to the medical college, he gets an MD, and is really among the first graduating class. What's interesting about him is he's apparently very financially successful and was a very active member of KKBE, because I've read in various places that when Beth Elohim got in financial trouble, Rodriguez put up the money to keep the place open. So he was very, even though he himself was not particularly observant, he was very active with KKBE. He's very involved in the National Organization of Dentistry. So he is involved in some of the first national meetings. In 1839, there's an organization launched the first dental journal in America. And then the South Carolina Dental Association was formally organized April 5, 1870. He's a charter member. He's at the meeting in American Dental Convention in August of 1855. And then when the American Dental Association is organized in Niagara, New York, he is there. So he's really a nationally known prominent figure in dentistry. He's involved with all branches of dentistry, but in particular, advanced prosthetic dentures, which apparently he was very involved in. So, there's a very interesting family, very prominent family, very involved with KKB. And you can see a little ad here for him as a dentist. And this is one of his competitors, Solomon's, who's also a doctor, but also a dentist. So,
the professions just hadn't separated by that time.
Yeah.
I mean, they were the same.
Doctor and a dentist. So,
yeah.
So much for Dr. Rodriguez.
Okay. Let's move on to the DeLeon family. This is really, I wish we had more images. There really ought to be with the prominence of this family. We're left with sort of an ad and a gravestone and then the son. The DeLeon, the sort of story of the DeLeons is just what Robert was talking about. They come from the West Indies to Charleston. Jacob DeLeon the father he eventually has two sons who are physicians, and he's a businessman. His eldest son, Abraham, becomes a physician. I presume he was trained. We don't know exactly the details, but apparently trained in a physician's office in Charleston. And he then goes to Camden and is both a physician and a druggist, a pharmacist. His brother, Mordecai, then apprentices with his brother and learns and is trained in his brother's medical office. And then Dr. Mordecai Hendricks de Leon goes to Columbia, where he opens a small hospital, and he quickly acquires a reputation as the city's premier physician. Thomas Cooper, Dr. Thomas Cooper, who was the president of South Carolina College, later, of course, University of South Carolina, renowned figure. He was his physician. Mary Chestnut, the famous diarist whose husband was a United States senator, he was her physician. And in 1833, he's elected to the first of 3 terms as the mayor of Columbia. He is a fascinating figure and an important person in the history of the Jewish community. He is also, just like Dr. Rodriguez, Dr. de Leon is very active in Jewish affairs. He's president of the Hebrew Benevolent Society. He's one of the founders of the Hebrew Benevolent Society. He is just a real player in the Jewish community. And again, it speaks to the openness of South Carolina at this time.
I didn't know when you want to preheat the grill.
Perhaps, it just speaks to the incredible openness of the.
No, I already put the tater tots in though.
Rachel, could you see if we could address
You
that?
gotta get that casserole in the oven.
What?
Yeah. Can we? In any regard, it does speak to the openness and inclusiveness of these Jewish professionals in this era. This one in the 1830s, and of course Levi Myers in an earlier era. Now, the gentleman on the right is David Camden de Leon, the son of Mordecai Hendricks de Leon, and Robert laughs that every early history of the Jews of America always mentioned the prominence of David Camden de Leon because he served as the Surgeon General of the Confederacy, which by all accounts apparently lasted for about an hour. But he's actually a very fascinating figure. First of all, he goes off to the University of Pennsylvania for his medical training. There are 2 great medical schools at the time in America. There is Columbia University and University of Pennsylvania. He goes to the University of Pennsylvania. He comes home, practices in Columbia briefly, but then he joins the United States Army as a Army physician. And he really distinguishes himself. He eventually rises to the position of the Assistant Surgeon General of the United States. And what really gets everybody's attention about him is he's a physician during the Mexican-American War. And there's a battle in the war in which all the officers are killed. And Dr. de Leon, takes the leadership. He was an officer, he was a major, but he had no military training, and he led the troops to victory. And he was recognized in newspapers across the country as the fighting doctor. And he had a congressional commendation for courage. So here's this guy who is just, a professional physician and soldier in the Union Army, and South Carolina then succeeds. And what does he do? And he writes his brother, and he says, I have fought under the United States flag, and every stripe is dear to me. He says, he observes that treason and patriotism are next door neighbors, and only accident makes you strike the right knocker. Isn't that a great line? And what he does, he resigns his commission, and he joins the Confederate Army, and he is immediately made the acting Surgeon General of the United States. And he develops, I don't know what his history had been, but he seems to develop a very serious drinking problem. I'm wondering whether he's conscience stricken by this choice he's made. Who knows? But he he eventually is removed from that position, but then Robert E. Lee appoints him in charge of the entire medical operation of the Army of Northern Virginia, and he's removed from that for the same reason. And then his brother is this secret emissary to France. They're trying to get the French to recognize the Confederacy, which was a challenge because the French were very anti-slavery. And they send his brother, I think it's Thomas Cooper de Leon, over to France, and he has this secret operation to influence French public opinion. And he does it by bribing French reporters to write favorable stories. And the whole thing comes out. Dr. de Leon's over there with his brother. It becomes a huge scandal, and whatever efforts were going on in France were completely sunk by the efforts of the de Leons. And Judah Benjamin, the renowned Jewish Secretary of State of the Confederacy, was unaware the de Leons were over there and ordered them home. So anyway, but it's a fascinating story. Three physicians from this family, Dr. de Leon, after the war, lived in actually the New Mexico territory and practiced medicine there. Okay, why don't we, Alan Nussbaum, why don't you and Dr. Greenberg talk to us about Columbus de Vega?
You're muted, Alan.
There we go. Sorry. It is my pleasure to welcome back to South Carolina, if only electronically, Dr. Ray Greenberg, who has a long history here. First as academic vice president, and then the president of MUSC for a number of years. And he went to Texas after that, but he still really belongs to us here. And Ray and I have been friends for, I think, 44 years, since I met him when he was a medical student and I was an intern. And I can tell you from those interactions, he saved me many times, because we worked together for about a month and it was wonderful. But we're going to talk about Columbus de Vega. And I want to just let Ray start by telling us how he came to meet this guy who really no one else had very much heard of.
So thanks, Alan, and it's great to see you and Nita after all these years. And I really stumbled on Columbus de Vega completely by accident about 10 or 11 years ago. There was an illustrated history of the medical university that the historian Susan Hoffius had written. And I'm leafing through it, and there's a picture in there of this fellow Columbus de Vega, who graduated from the medical college in the 1850s. And to be honest, I had no idea that there were Jews that graduated from the medical college at that period of time. I was very familiar with the fact that there were quotas during the 20th century. And many people told me their personal stories of not being admitted or having to go through a difficult process to get admitted to the medical university. So it was amazing to me that there were Jews being trained at the medical university in the mid-19th century. And I learned a little bit more about him. There's not a tremendous amount known about de Vega. He was born, he's one more of the Sephardic Jews that we're talking about tonight. His grandfather came and grandmother came from Spain. They settled in Charleston, were shopkeepers. His grandfather was Moses de Vega. His father was Isaac de Vega, who was also a shopkeeper. Columbus was one of 7 children, 2 of whom died in childhood. He was the youngest of the surviving children. And his father tragically was killed in an accident at sea when Columbus was about 4 or 5 years old. So the family was really, I don't want to say in poverty, but he was forced to work at a very young age. He worked in a dry goods store in Charleston, earned enough money to go essentially to night school. He trained with Dr. Pritchard, a physician in Charleston, and then enrolled in the medical university and graduated in 1852. And at the time, as Richard said, many of the graduates, they're sort of equivalent to an internship and residency was to go to the main centers of medicine in Europe. And at that time, in the mid-19th century, Paris was one of the great centers. Here's an illustration that has nothing directly to do with De Vega, but this is Laennec, who is the inventor of the stethoscope, which he's holding in his left hand here, showing his students how to sculpt the heart sounds with a nurse on the side here. But this is just to illustrate that that many people from around the world came to Paris to study medicine at the time. And he went actually with a couple, one of his classmates and then someone who graduated a year after them. They were there for a year and then got recruited, the next slide, by the Russian army to provide medical services for the Russian troops in the Crimean War. You probably, as I don't, know much about the Crimean War, but it was launched by the Tsar, who wanted the Turks to become under the Russian Orthodox Church, but it was really a land grab, is what it was all about. And on the left here, we see it was a really horrific bloodletting, the number of casualties. This is in the Battle of Sebastopol being the worst part of it. De Vega was a physician from 54 to 56 when the war ended. They were just overrun with casualties that they were caring for. One of his South Carolina colleagues talked about assisting in 45 surgeries a day and doing 15 more on his own. So it was just one patient after another. And on the right, diagram is a figure of a hospital ship. Much of the war was taking place on and around the Black Sea. So having medical facilities is a new innovation introduced during the war. And they also developed floating batteries that could be put into position very close to cities and basically used to bombard the cities. And then the war ended, peace was declared, and De Vega came back to the United States.
So tell me a little bit more about this floating battery, and also the what happened with this concept once he got back and became involved in the Civil War.
So he's back in the United States in around 1856. And as we all well know, just a few years later, war broke out in Charleston. And one of the things that was developed is pictured on the right here is a floating battery. And the front part of that is sort of to the left diagram. That's the battery part. You see Fort Sumter off in the distance. This was actually anchored right off of Sullivan's Island, not too far from where we lived when I lived on Sullivan's Island. There were 4 cannons that you can see positioned in the floating battery. And in the back of it, there's some sandbags, sort of counterweights. And then immediately behind that is a little, looks like a little house, floating house there. And then on the left-hand side, we see the interior view of it. There are 10 beds in this, and there was natural light brought in through these skylights, and patients were to be cared for. During the bombardment of the 36 hours or whatever it was, the floating battery was hit multiple times. The hospital was not hit. There was one hit that caused an injury, and I imagine that patient was taken care of by Dr. De Vega and his team in the floating hospital behind the battery. Now,
Do you think that De Vega really brought this back from the Crimean War, and is this something that was present in other places in the Civil War?
Well, the idea of the floating battery part of it certainly came from the Crimean War, and the hospital part, I think, as far as I know, that's really De Vega's innovation to add that to it.
Did it catch on in other places, or was this the only one?
I'm not aware. Of course, the ironclads really took over the conflict. So they're, rather than being stationary, moored floating battery. They had warships that were ironclad. And as far as I'm aware, there weren't other hospitals that were floating hospitals.
I didn't realize until I read about this in your notes that there were shells that were non-exploding shells and shells that were exploding shells, and they did different things to different structures. And it was the ironclads that really protected against the explosion. And that was a novel thing from Crimea, wasn't it?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And it was steel from railroads that was first used to cover and protect the floating battery. And then the floating battery, after Fort Sumter was taken, had no real utility. So they took the steel off of it, the iron off of it, and used it for mobile ships, ironclad ships. So
tell us what he did after the war.
So if you notice in the background of this picture, there's a character. I'm gonna give you a little close up on the next slide of him, hopefully. You see in the kind of middle picture, and I think that may be the gentleman to the immediate right. And if you look on the far left, you'll see a catalog from the medical college for the class of 1860-61, and you'll see down there J.A. Booth from Philadelphia was precepted by Columbus de Vega. I don't know of any other students that de Vega was the preceptor for, but this J.A. Booth is kind of an interesting character because he's the younger brother of John Wilkes Booth. Of course, the medical school shut down during the war, and so he left during his first year of medical school, actually went out to the West Coast, did a bunch of other things, and then eventually came back to the East Coast and finished medical school elsewhere and practiced medicine. It's kind of an interesting twist that Columbus de Vega was indirectly 1 degree of separation from John Wilkes Booth.
And what about his practice? He was back in South Carolina after the war, correct? Or did he went to New York for a while?
Right. So when Charleston was under bombardment in 1863, he went up to Columbia. And then after the war ended, he went up to New York in 1868, was there for 2 or 3 years where he met his wife. I know almost nothing about her. They were married there and then came back to Charleston in 1870, where he reestablished his medical practice. He was elected to the Medical Society of South Carolina. He was extremely active in both the Hebrew Benevolent and the Hebrew Orphan Society, was cited for his charitable work and given a silver service by the Hebrew Orphan Society. And then in 1881, this patent is a patent application from de Vega. So he was also an inventor. This is called an audiophone. And it was basically, it turns out that de Vega lost most of his hearing during the bombardment of Sebastopol. So he was nearly deaf after the war. And he developed this device which is held between the teeth, and there are 17 wires that are on the blade part, the spatula looking part. And so they pick up the vibrations that then are mediated through the teeth to the ear. And I don't know how successful it was, but it was successful enough to win the US patent. And tragically, de Vega died just a year later in 1882. And this is he was buried, he was a member of KKBE, and he was buried in the Cumming Street Cemetery, and this is his tombstone there.
The floating battery. The floating battery at the hospital is very prominent in the history of Charleston and the Civil War. So whenever you see illustrated histories of the firing on Fort Sumter, it's a big deal, so he's part of that.
And let me just ask Richard, after the war, I mean, the de Vegas really don't exist in Charleston anymore, but there are de Vega families in Columbia.
Oh yeah, I knew the de Vegas in Columbia. And you know, it doesn't sound like, and maybe it was a child left there, you know, stayed in Colombia, but they're definitely De Vegas in Colombia to this day.
Are they Jewish?
No. But, you know, very few of the Sephardim to this day are Jewish. You know, most of the, if you look at the members of the synagogues and across South Carolina, you know, I would dare say 85% or more are the descendants of Eastern European and Russian Jews. Some German Jews, very few Sephardim.
Recently, I've connected, and I don't know if she's on the call, but Susan Gibbons is a descendant of Columbus de Vega's brother. And she actually shared with me a portrait that she has of Isaac, the father of Columbus and his brother. So they're all over the country now, but broadly in the South, descendants of the De Vegas.
Well, that's just fascinating. What an interesting character. Alan, are we exhausted our Columbus de Vega for now?
To move on, I guess.
I guess we can move on. Robert,
Yeah.
let's talk about Simon Baruch.
Well, of course, we couldn't talk about Jewish doctors in South Carolina without Simon Baruch. Now, here what happens is we're moving from the Sephardic Jews to the German Jews because Simon Baruch was a Prussian immigrant from Posen in Prussia, and he comes to America in 1840. And of course, this is the beginning of the German immigration of German Jews. And he goes to Camden, South Carolina, where he lives with the Mannis family, who are from his hometown. He decides he's a very accomplished young man. He comes to Charleston, goes to the medical college, and then actually during the war, he graduated from the Medical College of Virginia. During the Civil War, he has a very illustrious career. He's called an assistant surgeon, which I have an idea means sort of like a nurse. I mean, I don't think it means anything, like a medical assistant. But he did have medical training, and he did go to medical school, but he'd never actually done an operation. So he gets involved in the war, and he says one battle, he's invited into the hospital, and the doctor needs some help, and he says, you know, come over and assist me. So that's when he actually does his first surgery. You know, it's like in the war, and of course, you know, these Civil War doctors were famous for cutting off limbs and probably killing as many people as they say. But he served throughout the war. He actually ran the medical hospital at Gettysburg, and was a very he served in the Confederate Army for a long time. After the war, he goes back to Camden, and he's a sort of a country doctor in Camden. But in the 1880s, he moves to New York, where he becomes an extremely successful doctor. The Baruchs were living on West 57th Street, which at that time was the northernmost fringe of Manhattan. And he also got involved in public health. And he's quoted as saying that Manhattan is a body of land surrounded by sewerage. So I think he helped clean up Manhattan. And of course, he is the father of Bernard Baruch. And that's what makes him so interesting. Bernard Baruch, you know, for most of the older people on this program anyway, was probably the most prominent Jewish person in America in the early 20th century. He served as chairman.
Right, he was advisors to Woodrow Wilson and Franklin Roosevelt.
Yeah, well, he was chairman of the War Industries Board during World War I. And he really was a prominent figure in the Wilson administration. By the time of the Roosevelt administration, he was one of the wealthiest, most prominent Jewish people in America. I think Roosevelt sort of put up with him. I don't know how important he was in the Roosevelt administration, but in any event, of course, Bernard Baruch maintained his connection to South Carolina, and, you know, bought that famous plantation near Georgetown. And so, you know, he's still
where Churchill visited.
Yeah, where Franklin Roosevelt visited, and I guess Churchill did visit. Yeah, what's the name of it?
Hobcall Barony, and Roosevelt and FDR would go there, as would
Yeah.
Churchill. So,
Yeah, but mostly FDR met his girlfriend there because the railroad connected her from Aiken to Hopcaw Valley. But I mean,
And also Michelle Obama's father was a slave on that plantation, or great-grandfather.
right. So but the point being, in terms of physicians, he's certainly one of the more interesting characters in South Carolina history.
okay, Lily, let's talk about Dr. Rosa Hirschman Gant.
My pleasure. Now we're going to talk about the first woman doctor in South Carolina. And she apparently excelled in everything she did. It was written in the Woman's Medical Journal in November of 1919. Rosa Gant goes over the top on everything she does. And that was a quote. So she was born, and her name is Love Rosa Hirschman. And then she married a lawyer, Robert Gant. She was born in December of 1874 in Camden. And then the family moved to Cades, South Carolina. Her mother passed away when she was 14 years old, and she's the oldest of 3 girls, and she took care of her younger siblings, but was determined to go to medical school, and she did. She was the first of 2 women to graduate from the Medical College of South Carolina, now known as MUSC. Her life was so full and so robust in so many areas that I decided to divide her life into areas that we could all keep up with. So we're going to start with her personal life a little bit. As I mentioned, she met an attorney, Robert James Gant, in Spartanburg, South Carolina, and they married in March of 1905. By this time, Rosa was practicing medicine in Spartanburg, and her husband was an accomplished lawyer and a writer. They never had any children. But Rosa was an active member of the Jewish community in Spartanburg and helped to build the first synagogue, Temple B'nai Israel, and to establish the Women's Auxiliary of Temple B'nai Israel, which was incorporated in 1916. The auxiliary offered hospitality to converse students, and during World War I offered religious services and entertainment for soldiers at Camp Wadsworth. In 1924, Rosa, negotiated Spartanburg's first Jewish burial section in Oakwood Cemetery, and she ultimately became president of the South Carolina Federation of Temple Sisterhoods. That was her personal life, but now let's talk about her community life. She almost immediately became interested in the community, both professionally and personally. She was an active suffragist from 1914 and was known to be, and I quote, on the cutting edge of suffrage activity, as stated by Dr. Diane Vecchio in our 2020 magazine. She blended her strong Jewish identity with prevailing social concerns, and as a member of the South Carolina Equal Suffrage League, became one of the few women who balanced both professional and political activism, ultimately becoming the chair of the South Carolina Equal Suffrage League. Additionally, she was one of the first to establish a public health mobile, staffing it with herself and nurses and riding into rural areas to give advice and treatment. But now listen to her professional characteristics and what she achieved. She graduated, as I said, then the Medical College of South Carolina, and continued postgraduate education at the Oral and Ophthalmic Institute and New York Ear and Eye Hospital in New York. Rosa was appointed as a resident physician in Rock Hill in Winthrop College, which was founded in 1886. But after 1 year, she left Rock Hill to move to Spartanburg and establish her medical practice as an ENT. As stated earlier, she met and married her husband in 1905, but in addition to her practice, she pioneered work in rural public health in a traveling bus that you can see here. It's in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. And they had the slogan, bringing health to the country. This was one of her greatest achievements. This is what she really reveled in. But she was also very instrumental in preventing tuberculosis, studying and preventing pellagra, and stressing environmental and personal hygiene. She was the only woman on the draft board during World War I and advanced to a position of the District Advisory Medical Board of Appeals. She served as acting surgeon for the United Public Health Service and was a member of the Fosdick Committee of War Camp Community Service. She held a commission from the United States Department of Commerce as medical examiner of air pilots. Maybe that's why she was asked, because of her ENT experience. Despite being the only woman in Spartanburg in the Medical Society, she served as president for 9 years, and in 1932 became president of the American Medical Women's Association. She was instrumental in encouraging the construction of Spartanburg Regional Hospital, and she was a prolific writer and an author of many medical works which were published in Southern medical journals. However, in 1935, right before she was supposed to turn 61 years old, she was transferred to a Philadelphia hospital when she became very ill. She underwent a hysterectomy, but died within 2 weeks of that surgery because of uterine cancer. And as I mentioned, she was just shy of her 61st birthday. And I'd like to end with a quote from Dr. Vecchio, who had studied her greatly. Gant was a New South progressive who served her community while challenging gender barriers, as we are continuing to do, as a doctor and a suffragist. She was quite an amazing lady.
What a story. You know, I think it's just so interesting that over these centuries, Lily, we've got these Jewish physicians who are not just taking their basic training, they're going way out. I mean, how many ENTs were there in South Carolina, and how many women ENTs? I can only guarantee there's one, right? At
that time, for sure. And as Dr. Greenberg pointed out in our previous conversations, it's not as if we have an abundance of ENTs practicing today. So you can imagine in 1901 that this was a very unique specialty for a woman.
Yeah, it's really something special. Thank you. Okay, to the Allens, Alan Nussbaum and Alan Benoff. Alan, you're muted still.
Alan, you're muted.
Alan, you're muted. Yeah, there you go.
Nope. Okay.
Yep, there you go. Nope. There
Okay,
you go. Yes.
I'm unmuted. We now get,
Nope, you're muted again.
And move your cursor.
Move your cursor.
how's that?
Yeah, it's good.
Okay, we move now to the later part of the 20th century where
Nope, you're hit again, Alan. I don't know what's going on there.
Move the cursor from the mute button.
Yeah, move the cursor away.
it's away.
Okay.
We'll see. Let me know if I get muted again. But Dr. Banoff is the first.
No, you're muted again.
I'm going to another computer.
He's going to need his computer. I guarantee you that it'll be better.
Well, my kids were watching all of us struggling with muting, and they were getting a big kick out of it. So I just, at least we're entertaining the young people.
I'm in a new place and I'm unmuted.
Good.
So we go to the first person who I think is in this medical thing that we're doing is someone that many people knew in Charleston, and some on this call may have remembered him. Dr. Leon Banoff Sr., who was a fascinating man, and we're really fortunate to have his grandson, Alan Banoff, to present about him, and then we'll talk a little bit about his extraordinary life. And I think I said this before, and I think that he's probably one of the most influential people in South Carolina medicine ever, and perhaps the premier influential person in the 20th century.
Fascinating.
Alan.
Okay. He was born Lazar Banovich in 1888 in a little town called Kopchewa in Russian-occupied Poland in the Suwalki gubernia. In July 1895, at age 7, he crossed the ocean with his mother, a sister, and a brother, and joined his father in Charleston. When Leon arrived in Charleston, he spoke only Yiddish. He didn't speak any secular language. He didn't speak English, but he learned English and other subjects at Bennett School and was homeschooled. As a teenager, because his family was poor, he had to work. He answered a want ad to work in a drugstore. He loved telling the story that after he left that job, the pharmacist advertised, quote, Jewish preferred. After working in the drugstore, he decided he would become a pharmacist. He did so, graduating with a degree in pharmacy from the Medical College of South Carolina in April 1907 at age 19, hadn't gone to college. For a few years, Leon operated a pharmacy on Upper King Street. Reflecting his sense of humor, his slogan was, the largest drugstore in the South for its size. He was also teaching at the Medical College's pharmacy school, but his medical education did not end there. He matriculated at the Medical College in 1908 while operating his drugstore, and he received his MD in June 1917. Because he was on the college faculty, he was permitted to be a part-time student in the medical school. My grandfather told the story that when he was a medical student, my father was born, Dr. Leon Banov Jr. was born in 1914, that he would have my father holding on his shoulder, and he would be reading a medical book with the other hand and walk around to calm my father down when he was a baby. Meanwhile, in 1912, my grandfather entered public service as assistant city bacteriologist. 6 years later, he became the city's chief food inspector. He held that position during the outbreak of the Spanish flu of 1918. There's an article about his actions during the Spanish flu in the Historical Society's fall 2020 issue. It was written by a panel member. One of my grandfather's tasks as chief food inspector was to inspect milk to make sure it was not watered down or contained impurities. A severe milk-borne typhoid fever epidemic broke out in Charleston. As he later said to the News and Courier, that's when I began agitating for pasteurization. There was considerable opposition by local government officials who said that certified milk was just as safe as pasteurized milk. They sent my grandfather to New Jersey to look at a certified milk plant. There he learned that the dairy was pasteurizing milk to give to its calves. The dairy foreman explained to him, we can't have our valuable calves drinking raw milk. After he explained this, the opposition to pasteurization evaporated. In December 1919, he convinced the city council to adopt an ordinance to require dairies to pasteurize milk. This was the first law in the country to require it, and the ordinance was apparently the second public health law in the country. In the spring of 1920, Charleston County created a health department. He was previously in the Charleston City Health Department, and named my grandfather as the first director. In 1926, the city of Charleston asked him to be the city health officer as well. And for a while, he was going back and forth between the two offices. After a while, the city and the county created a combined city-county health department with my grandfather as director. My brother-in-law, Les Bergen, suggests I tell you the story about my grandfather. Once a police officer became a coroner, the county coroner, despite having no medical qualifications whatsoever. He asked my grandfather to help with his first case, an old man found dead in his bed. My grandfather told him the deceased had died of, quote, senility. Later, my grandfather learned the unqualified coroner had indicated that a 2-week-old baby had also died of senility. Indeed, the coroner had listed senility as a cause of death of other people who were between the ages of 20 and 40 years old.
Ellen, let me ask you a question. Your grandfather seemed to negotiate the politics of Charleston, which were pretty rough in those days. I mean, I think there was municipal corruption, as in most cities, and he managed to get things done. And you say that in the autobiography that he wrote, or a story of his career, he really didn't name names. How did he get by? How did he deal with this political intrigue, and how did he win these fights?
I think it was through a combination of perseverance He was a stubborn guy, but he also used humor, he used logic, and he was steadfast in his belief that good medicine would help the community. He didn't tolerate unscrupulous or incompetent politicians. He wanted to advocate public health for everybody.
Tell the story about how he got punched in the nose.
That's a good story. At some point, the mayor, he didn't name the name in his book. The book is, as I recall, he doesn't name any names in here. He doesn't give any dates in here. I think it may have been around 1940, 1942. I'm not sure. The mayor of Charleston had a troublesome secretary he wanted to get rid of. He named him as the chief sanitarian for the city health department, even though he wasn't qualified for this position. And he had a lot of friction with my grandfather. Later, he grew angry with my grandfather after my grandfather countermanded the man's orders. And in the presence of his staff, he said, "If you do not have your glasses on, I will punch you in the nose." My grandfather took off his glasses and asked, "What did you say?" The sanitarian punched Leon in the face. And my grandfather didn't strike back, but he said, "You're suspended." And he later wrote that that was the most welcome blow he'd ever felt in his entire life, because he realized then the Board of Health would not tolerate this guy being in his office and would fire him, which they did do. About the same time, a city council committee, this is an example of his humor, I guess. City council committee summoned my grandfather for questioning about the health department's appropriations. And the committee chairman challenged my grandfather, "Dr. Banov, I understand that you own quite a large estate across the Cooper River." Leon responded, "I hardly call it an estate." Well, the chairman followed up, "Well, how many acres do you really own?" My grandfather then got paper and pencil, and he started writing down 100, 200, 400. That was all a ruse. And he said, "Well, I've got 2 lots, 200 by 100 feet each." And he asked, how many acres would that be? The committee laughed uproariously, and the chairman's face grew so red, my grandfather wrote he thought he was having a heart attack or a stroke. It turned out he bought these 2 lots at a sheriff's sale. The guy didn't pay taxes, and the sheriff sold these things. And on one of those lots, my grandfather built a cinder block house. We called it the shack. It was hardly any estate. As health director for the city and county for over 40 years, he left a profound legacy. He instituted mass vaccinations of great numbers of Charlestonians, including African Americans in the city and on the islands. He created wellness clinics for new mothers and schools for midwives, dramatically reducing the city's infant mortality, which had been one of the worst in the country. He also improved sanitation throughout the county, including giving restaurants score sheets to be displayed in their windows and closing those which failed. An A scorecard was what you wanted to get. He controlled the rat population in the Low Country and eradicated malaria through mosquito control in the marshes. He promoted free vaccinations against smallpox, eliminating that disease in the county. He created an 80-bed hospital for tuberculosis, of which one of his sisters had died. He had a TV program in the early days of television to give advice to viewers on their health. It was called You and Your Health. I was on there in the background a couple of times. Due to his efforts, Charleston was one of the sites selected for the initial demonstration of the Salk polio vaccine. In fact, he made my sister, Jane Banov Bergen, and me guinea pigs to try out the vaccine. It worked, we didn't die, it was okay for the rest of the county. According to the South Carolina Encyclopedia, quote, despite South Carolina's small public health allocations, Banov attracted the attention of peers throughout the country and both federal and private funding sources because of his efficiency and diligence. Many of his accomplishments are recited in a book written by Dr. William Atmar Smith. It's called Leon Banov, MD, and Public Health in Charleston, written in 1968. My grandfather received many honors in his lifetime. He was elected president of the Charleston County Medical Society. You know, being Jewish didn't prevent that. He was president of the South Carolina Public Health Association. In 1960, the College of Charleston awarded him an honorary Doctor of Laws. In 1961, before he retired, Charleston County named the new Health Department building on Lockwood Boulevard in his honor. And in 1970, he published a book, as I recall, The Story of the Charleston County Health Department. It was also a semi-autobiography of his long career as county health director. And in his book, he mentioned he didn't observe any anti-Semitism against him, and indeed experienced ecumenical gestures. In 2020, more recently, the Post-Courier decided to award Leon Banov Banners of Distinction to restaurants which observe the highest standards in sanitation during the pandemic. Now, other Banovs became doctors. My father, Leon Jr., my cousin Charles Banov, and his sons, Mark and Michael Banov. Another cousin, David Banov, is a physician. Cousin Max Brenner, who's on here, is a retired oral surgeon. And cousin Billy Brenner is also a retired doctor. My grandfather did pretty well for a Jewish immigrant whose father had little money and could not give him a boost in his medical career.
Alan, let me let you go back, back to 1918. Talk a little bit about the management that he had of the great flu pandemic of 1918, and then sort of hypothesize about how your grandfather would have felt about our current response to COVID.
Well, he was actually very, very strict. Even at the time of the 1918 Spanish flu, he was a city chief food inspector for the city. He wasn't yet medical director, public health director. He went to restaurants to make sure that they were clean and everything. In 1918, he found that soda fountains weren't sterilizing the utensils properly, so he recommended to the health director that all soda fountains be closed and kept closed until the danger of the spread of influenza had ceased. That letter was reprinted in its entirety in the News and Courier, and it mentioned that Dr. Green, the public health director, rejected my grandfather's advice. But at that time, they were insisting upon masking. They were insisting upon distancing, social distancing. At the time, meetings and gatherings that called for more than 4 or 5 people were banned. They closed down schools and churches, therefore. So he was very, very active at that time in making sure that the county and the city survived the pandemic. And some of those same types of mechanisms are used today, of course.
Amazing. What a great story. How many people did he, you think about people who, physicians in a private practice, they have a certain finite group of people they are able to treat and help. Dr. Banov was basically the doctor for Charleston.
For thousands of people, thousands.
Yeah, it's really quite a story.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Lily?
Yes, thank you very much. I want to mention that this program has been recorded, so that if you have a part of it you'd like to look at again or share with your community, it'll be available in the next couple of days. Rachel does a very good job of notifying all participants when it becomes available. I'd like to also mention and remind everybody that we will have a 3rd session for South Carolina Jews in Medicine in November. You'll need to check on the date. That has not yet been decided, but it will be in the month of November. But I want to remind you also that we have a meeting in October. This is our joint meeting with the Southern Historical Society from the 21st of October to the 24th. And on the 24th, we have our business meeting. And that's really important that you tune in 11 o'clock on that Sunday, bring your coffee and bagel, and we have society business and we have election of officers. I have to say that I do have the dubious distinction of being president of the society for 2 years, but we've never had an in-person meeting. So I hope at some point I'll be able to meet most of you in person. And I finally want to give another congratulations to our two award-winning hosts today, Richard Gergel and Robert Rosen. For those that may have come in a little bit later, they have been awarded the Jewish, well, let me see, the Order of the Jewish Palmetto. And this is a very coveted award. We've only had 6 other times that we have given this out. This makes number 7. And I can't think of 2 more perfect gentlemen to receive this. It's been a pleasure working with both of you, and we look forward to having many wonderful Sunday conversations in the future. So with that, I ask everyone to please remember we're still in COVID mode. Get your vaccination if you haven't. Please stay safe. Join us virtually in October, and I wish you all adieu. Good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Congratulations, Richard. Congratulations, Robert.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you.
Congratulations, Richard and Robert.
Good program.
Excellent program. Thank you.
Thank y'all.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks to my family for joining us.
An outstanding, just outstanding. Thank you, Richard and Robert.